It wasn't the clatter of the stainless steel tray that echoed loudest in the hallway of Northwood Memorial. It was the silence that swallowed it whole. A silence so thick it felt heavier than the discarded medical supplies now scattered across the polished linoleum floor. No apologies, not even a flinch of surprise from the woman who'd caused it. Just the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic that seemed to grow colder, harsher. It was as if the hurried, rhythmic life of the hospital, the distant beeps of monitors, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes, the low hum of life-saving machines, had held its breath, bearing witness to a moment of quiet, casual cruelty. This was the world Samuel Jones inhabited. At 68, his hands, knotted with the first signs of arthritis, were more accustomed to turning the fragile pages of classic literature than gripping the cold handle of a janitor's mop. He was a ghost in the machine of Northwood, visible only when something was spilled, broken, or discarded. Earlier that day, in the quiet solitude of a third-floor utility closet that smelled of bleach and old paper, he had been a king. He sat on an overturned bucket, his back straight, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. In his hands was a worn copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace, its spine soft as old cloth. His movements were slow, deliberate, a quiet protest against the frantic pace just outside the door. Chloe Tran, a nursing student with bright, idealistic eyes, had seen him once. She'd rounded a corner and stopped, watching this old man trace the words on a page with a reverence she usually only saw in surgeons preparing for an operation. He had looked up, his eyes kind and surprisingly sharp, and offered her a small, dignified nod. She had smiled back, a moment of silent, human connection in a place that often felt devoid of it. But that connection meant nothing to Nurse Brenda Miller. Brenda moved through the hospital hallways like a storm front, her presence announced by a sharp clip of her heels and a trail of nervous energy. She was a woman of immense competence and equally immense bitterness, a ruler in her small kingdom of scrubs and charts. She saw the world in terms of efficiency and hierarchy. And Samuel Jones was, to her, at the very bottom. He was an obstacle, a slow-moving piece of furniture. Earlier, he had held a swinging door open for her. She had marched through without a word, without a glance, her focus already on the next task, the next problem to be solved. And now, that problem was the spilled tray. It had been her tray, knocked from a rolling cart not by accident, but by a gesture of pure impatience. She had needed something from the bottom of the cart and had shoved the tray aside with a careless, angry motion. It had tipped, and the world had briefly fallen silent. Now, she stood over the mess, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed not on the scattered tools, but on Samuel, who had arrived with his cart, his expression unreadable. "Well?" Brenda's voice was clipped, sharp as broken glass. "Are you going to stare at it all day?" Samuel didn't answer. He simply knelt, his old knees protesting with a soft crackle, and began to pick up the larger pieces of metal. His dignity was a shield, but it was a shield Brenda seemed determined to shatter. "Clean it up, Samuel," she said, her voice low enough not to attract the attention of the doctors down the hall, but loud enough to carry the full weight of her contempt. "And try to keep up. This is a hospital, not a library." The insult, so specific, so personal, hung in the air. Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of pain crossing his face before it was gone. Across the hallway, partially hidden behind a laundry cart, Chloe Tran watched, her heart pounding a sick rhythm against her ribs. A war raged behind her eyes, the fear of a student against the fury of a human being. Her hand, shaking, reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the record button. A small act of rebellion that felt like treason, but a silence that felt like a crime. She pressed record, the small red light a secret, burning promise in the cold, sterile hallway. The video on Chloe Tran's phone was a toxic secret, pulsing with a life of its own. For 3 hours, she sat in her tiny apartment, the city lights of the evening smearing against her window like wet paint, and watched it again and again. Each viewing was a fresh wave of sickness. She saw Nurse Brenda's dismissive cruelty, the cold indifference in her eyes. But mostly, she saw Mr. Jones. She saw the quiet resignation on his face as he knelt, the tremor in his hands as he picked up the scattered instruments, the way his entire body seemed to shrink under the weight of the humiliation. The video was more than just proof, it was a soul laid bare. Her student loans felt like a chain around her neck. A complaint from a powerful head nurse could end her career before it even began. Northwood Memorial was the best teaching hospital in the state. A black mark from them was a professional death sentence. But the image of Samuel's face, a mask of weary endurance, was a far heavier burden. With a deep, shuddering breath, she made a choice. She created a new, anonymous account on a public forum. The username a meaningless string of numbers. She uploaded the 47-second clip. For the caption, she wrote only 5 words. This happened today at Northwood Memorial. Then, she closed her laptop, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. What happened next was a digital wildfire. The video, raw and unflinching, was pure oxygen for the embers of online outrage. 1,000 views became 10,000. Then 100,000. Shares exploded across every platform. It was given hashtags. Hashtag Northwood Nightmare. Hashtag Justice for Samuel. The comment section was a torrent of human emotion. There was fury from nurses who felt Brenda disgraced their profession. There were stories from former Northwood employees detailing a toxic work environment. And there were thousands of messages from ordinary people who saw in Samuel a father, a grandfather, a neighbor, a human being deserving of dignity. By morning, it had surpassed 1 million views and was a top trending topic. The storm had broken, and it was aimed directly at the heart of Northwood Memorial. Miles away, in a quiet home office that smelled of old books and fresh coffee, David Jones was doing what he always did, hunting for stories. As one of the top investigative journalists for a national newspaper, his job was to find the cracks in the world and expose the rot within. He saw the headline on a news aggregator: viral video shows hospital nurse humiliating elderly janitor. He clicked, a familiar sense of professional weariness settling over him. He watched, his jaw tightening with the practiced anger of someone who saw injustice for a living. The nurse's behavior was appalling. The old man's quiet suffering was heartbreaking. He felt a pang of sympathy. The same he felt for a dozen other victims in a dozen other videos. He was about to close the tab when the camera, held by a shaky, amateur hand, shifted slightly. For a fraction of a second, the janitor looked up, his face caught perfectly in the harsh fluorescent light. David's breath hitched in his throat. The world tilted on its axis. The distant sound of city traffic outside his window faded to a dull roar. It wasn't just an elderly janitor. The worn-out hands, the kind eyes now clouded with pain, the dignified set of his jaw even in defeat. It was his father. He grabbed his phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy. It rang twice. Hello? Samuel's voice was the same calm, gentle baritone it had always been. Dad, David said, his own voice hoarse. Dad, I just saw a video. A pause stretched across the line, heavy with unspoken words. Oh, that, Samuel said, his tone impossibly light. It was just a small misunderstanding. Son, a bit of a stressful day for everyone. Don't you worry about it. But David could hear the lie. The deep, ingrained instinct of a man who never wanted to be a burden. Dad, she humiliated you. I'm all right. David, really, please, just let it be. David closed his eyes. The image of his father on his knees burned into his mind. The journalist in him was silent. It was the son who answered, his voice low and cold with a terrifying new resolve. I can't do that, Dad, I can't. The son's promise hardened into the journalist's crusade. David Jones didn't just get angry, he got organized. His apartment transformed into a war room. The walls covered in whiteboards filled with names, timelines, and connections. He started where all good investigations start, with the money. He pulled the public filings for Northwood Memorial's board of directors, a list of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures. He cross-referenced them with political donations and other business interests. He was building a map of power, looking for the fault lines. Meanwhile, the hospital itself was in full crisis mode. An emergency board meeting was called, the air thick with the panicked jargon of damage control. Their response was swift and predictable. Nurse Brenda Miller was placed on paid administrative leave pending a full investigation. A hollow gesture designed to placate the public. Their internal memos, however, told a different story. The real priority was identifying and silencing the source of the leak. Security was tightened. A new policy forbidding personal phone use in patient areas was circulated. The hospital was turning inward, building a fortress of silence. David knew the fortress's weakest point was its people. He needed to find the person who filmed the video. He watched the clip 100 times. Not at his father's face, but at the background. He noticed the reflection of a specific type of laundry cart used only by the oncology and cardiology wards. In the reflection on a stainless steel door handle, he saw a sliver of a light blue scrub top, the color worn by student nurses. He got a list of all interns assigned to those wards. He started making calls, his tone gentle, positioning himself not as a reporter hunting a story, but as the son of the man in the video, simply trying to understand what happened. Most hung up, terrified, but one paused, one hesitated. That was Chloe Tran. They met in a small, forgotten bookstore cafe miles from the hospital, the air smelling of old paper and dust. Chloe was a bundle of nerves, clutching a cold cup of tea, her eyes darting towards the door with every new customer. "You could lose your scholarship," David said, his voice even. "You could be blacklisted. You don't have to talk to me." Chloe looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. What she did was wrong, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everyone saw it. No one else did anything. I see your father every week. He asks me about my studies. He told me he used to be a professor. He's a good person." That was all David needed. He didn't push. He just listened as she recounted the story, her words painting a picture of an environment where Brenda's casual cruelty was an open secret, tolerated because she was efficient. "There have been other times," Chloe added, looking down at her hands. "Other complaints. I've heard the older nurses talking. They just disappear." That was the key. Armed with Brenda's name and a new direction, David reached out to a contact, a former HR manager he had helped with a wrongful termination case years ago. He asked for a favor. 2 days later, a plain brown envelope arrived at his apartment. It contained no letter, just printouts. 3 separate complaints filed against nurse Brenda Miller over the last 5 years. One from a young orderly, alleging verbal abuse. One from a patient's family, citing neglectful and demeaning behavior. One from another nurse, for workplace bullying. Each one was followed by the same official stamp, "Case reviewed." Internally resolved. The complaints hadn't disappeared. They had been buried. The rot wasn't just in one person, it was in the foundations of the building. David now had more than a viral video. He had a pattern. He had a systemic failure. He had a story that could burn Northwood's pristine reputation to the ground. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap. It wasn't just on David's newspaper website. It was a coordinated release with a major television news network. The headline was stark and damning: "The Unseen Sickness. Northwood Memorial's Pattern of Abuse and the Culture That Buried It." The article was a masterclass in investigative journalism. It opened with the viral video, the nation's shared point of reference. Then, it went deeper. It featured Chloe Tran's on the record account, her name now attached to her brave act. It detailed the 3 previously buried complaints against Brenda, with damning quotes from the victims who had thought their voices were lost forever. It laid out the hospital's financial ties and suggested a leadership more concerned with donors and public image than with the dignity of its staff and patients. The story didn't just point a finger at a nurse, it put the entire institution on trial in the court of public opinion. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the hospital. The board's carefully constructed wall of silence was obliterated. News vans camped outside the main entrance. The hospital's social media pages were flooded with the article, each share a fresh wave of public fury. Donors began calling, their voices laced with concern. The mayor's office released a statement demanding full transparency. The hospital was hemorrhaging the one thing it valued above all else, its reputation. By noon, the pressure was unbearable. Brenda Miller was called into the HR director's office. There was no investigation, no discussion. She was handed a box for her personal belongings and a termination letter. "This is a business decision," the director said, her voice devoid of emotion. Brenda, defiant to the end, her face a mask of rage, didn't argue. She simply turned and walked out, a queen dethroned from her sterile kingdom. But David's story had aimed higher than one person. It had aimed for the system. That afternoon, the chairman of the board, a man whose face was usually reserved for charity galas, stood before a hastily assembled press conference. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit suddenly ill-fitting. He announced Brenda Miller's termination, but the reporters in the room barely scribbled it down. They were waiting for the real news. And then it came. The chairman, reading from a prepared statement, announced the board had voted to bring in an external, independent oversight committee to conduct a full review of the hospital's HR policies and workplace culture. "We have failed," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We have failed to protect the most vulnerable among us. And we are committed to ensuring this never happens again." Watching the press conference on his laptop, David felt no elation, no triumphant surge. He just felt a quiet, profound sense of release, like a weight he didn't know he was carrying had finally been lifted. Justice, true justice, wasn't about revenge. It was about rebuilding, and the first stone had just been laid in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The world began to heal. David found his father not in the sterile hallways of the hospital, but in the sun-drenched sanctuary of his small backyard garden. Samuel was on his knees, not in humiliation, but in reverence, tending to a row of tomato plants. He looked up as David approached, his face calm, the deep lines around his eyes softened by the afternoon light. They didn't speak for a long time, simply sitting together as the sun began to set. "Your mother," Samuel said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have been so proud. She never could stand a bully." He placed a soil-stained hand on David's arm. "You didn't just do this for me, son. You gave a voice to people who thought they'd never be heard. That's a powerful thing." In that moment, Samuel was no longer a victim on a viral video, he was a father. Full of love and immense pride. His dignity not just restored, but magnified. Weeks later, Chloe Tran sat staring at her email inbox. She had quietly withdrawn from her internship at Northwood, prepared to face the consequences. Instead, she was looking at a message from the director of nursing at the city's other major hospital, a place known for its progressive culture. It was a formal offer for a paid residency position, but it was the personal note at the bottom that made her gasp. "Ms. Tran," it read, "in this profession, knowledge is vital, but courage and integrity are priceless. We would be honored to have you on our team." A tear rolled down her cheek, a testament to the fact that doing the right thing, no matter how terrifying, could forge its own rewards. The final echo of the story came a month later. Samuel went to visit an old friend who was a patient at Northwood Memorial. The hospital felt different, quieter, more attentive. As he walked down a hallway, a young nurse he'd never seen before stopped and looked at him. A flash of recognition crossed her face. She stepped forward, her smile genuine. "Mr. Jones?" she asked softly. It's an honor to meet you, sir." She held out her hand, and he took it. It was a small gesture, a fleeting moment, but in the hushed, sterile halls of Northwood, it was everything. It was respect. It was change. It was a promise that no one was invisible anymore. If this story reminded you that every person has a name, that every voice matters, and that dignity is not negotiable, then don't just scroll away. In the comments below, tell us about a time you witnessed an act of quiet courage. Your story matters. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the silence. Because while one voice can be a whisper, together, we can be a roar, of course. After weaving this narrative, here is the core message, crafted for the intended audience, along with a sincere call to action. At its heart, this story is a powerful reminder that our true worth is not etched onto a name tag or a job title, but is carried quietly within us. It speaks to the profound truth that a person's value is the sum of their experiences, their kindness, and their resilience, a library of wisdom that exists long after a career has ended. Samuel's story shows us that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is an unwavering light we hold inside, even in the face of disrespect. In a world that often moves too fast and celebrates only the loudest voices, we see the immense power of quiet courage, the shaky hand of a young woman who chooses to bear witness, and the fierce loyalty of a son who uses his voice to defend his father's honor. This story reminds us that everyone we encounter is living a life as vivid and complex as our own, filled with triumphs and sorrows we may never see. They are not defined by the uniform they wear or the task they perform, but by the character they have built over a lifetime. It is our shared responsibility to look closer, to see the person behind the role, and to offer the simple, profound gift of respect. That is why we invite you to share a memory of a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, or a moment you witnessed quiet dignity shine through, in the comments below. By sharing these stories, we can build a collection of reminders that the best parts of humanity are often found not in the headlines, but in the hallways of our everyday lives. Until next time, take care of one another.